Well, I think there are a number of actions that are necessary at all different levels. So clearly, progress in the global negotiations of putting together an architecture, for REDD are still necessary. So we need to have a financing regime. We need to have a common standard for establishing reference emission levels. We need to have a common idea of how to implement safeguards, for example. But that's not the only place where action needs to take place. And in fact, probably we need to start thinking more about REDD as a cross-scale challenge and think about how to link up, all the various institutions from the global level through the national level down to the local level that are necessary to have information flows about emission reductions flowing upward and revenues to compensate land users flowing downward, from all through those different levels. And as part of that, I think the jurisdictional scale, which is somewhere between the national scale and the pilot project level, is one that needs more attention. So the roles of provinces, for example, or subnational level governments is important. In addition to that, it's clear that the large-scale financing that I think many of us thought might be forthcoming sooner as a result of the international negotiations is probably going to be delayed. And so it's particularly important to build domestic constituencies for REDD as an objective delinked from the particular promise of international financial flows. And in addition, to maintain the focus on REDD as a payments for environmental services or PES type mechanism, but be clear that we're going to need to bundle that with other ways to improve forest management, be they traditional command and control measures or other sources of finance to bridge the gap between the current state of play and future international REDD financial flows. Well, what we mean by a no regrets agenda is things that make sense to do anyway, even if you don't care about reducing climate emissions. So, for example, we observe in many countries that there are policies in place that either directly or indirectly subsidize economic activities that lead to forest loss or degradation. And so by removing those subsidies or by doing a better job of capturing the rent from forest exploitation related activities, you can create fiscal space in the national budget, which would be a good thing to do even if you didn't care about the climate. So that's one set of examples of the economic policy tools. Another good set of examples of no regrets policies are improvements in governance more generally and in forest governance in particular. I mean, there are many reasons to clarify land tenure, to improve the rule of law, to stamp out corruption. There are lots of good things to do related to governance that would also be in support of a good REDD implementation program. Forest-related data is necessary for quite a number of forest management tasks. I mean, only if you know about, the forest status and trends can you make informed decisions about what kinds of policy tools or practices are necessary to put into place. The public needs better data about forests to be able to have input to that decision making. And certainly for a REDD mechanism to work and to be able to measure changes in deforestation and forest degradation rates and the carbon emission implications of those changes, we have to have that data. For example, in many countries there are industries that either depend on products from the forest or produce commodities that replace forests. And to the extent that those industries are subsidized, either by granting concessions to forest area at below cost or access to forest materials at below cost, those are indirect subsidies to those industries. And so, withdrawing those subsidies would be a way to align industrial development to economic efficiency, reduce pressure on the national budget, but also give more space for REDD to be successful, because then it would be more competitive with land uses that aren't otherwise being subsidized. Forest land tenure is very important in its own right for a lot of reasons, including The conflicts over forest land tenure is an important source of violence in rural areas, and clarifying land tenure could arguably reduce conflict and violence in rural areas. It's also important for economic efficiency. I mean, nobody's going to invest in a piece of land if it's not clear that they're going to be around to or have the rights to exploit the fruits from that land. And that's especially important for forests and tree crops, since they are such long-term investments. But forests are particularly important for REDD, especially to the extent that REDD is conceptualized as a payments for environmental services scheme, because in order to have a PES scheme operate, you need to know who the seller of the environmental service is. So if you don't know who owns the forest, it's hard to make the mechanism work. Now, we've done some research in Brazil in doing overlays of maps of where REDD would be economically viable as a payments for environmental services scheme, and then areas where that might be problematic because of unclear or contested land tenure. And it turns out that that unclear land tenure is a huge constraint. And this is even in Brazil, which has gone the furthest in, for example, recognizing the rights to forest land of smallholders or to indigenous groups. So clearly it's a big impediment to REDD around the world. Different parts of the book are aimed at different stakeholder groups and audiences. I think it's fair to say that the center of gravity of the book is aimed at national level policymakers and stakeholders in REDD, the REDD objective, as well as project level implementers and the things they need to keep in mind in both terms of both dealing with local communities and in the more technical side of implementing REDD projects. But clearly the international community is involved in developing an international, global framework for REDD, both in terms of finance, safeguards, reference levels, as well as financing REDD implementation. So the international community, donors, negotiators are part of our audience as well. I think there are reasons to be optimistic about the future prospects of REDD. Probably the most important is that more generally there's a growing appreciation of the fact that the world community will not be able to keep global warming below the 2°C threshold unless forests are part of the solution. You really can't get there from here unless we reduce degradation and deforestation. So I think the prospects for continued political will to make this work are good. You might say that REDD is an enterprise that's too important to fail, and so I think we can expect to see continued investment in efforts to make it work. We also see continuing attention in the context of the global negotiations to keep inching forward on setting up a global framework for REDD. And we also have a continuing appetite on the part of the donor governments to appropriate real money for this objective in the meantime, while we're waiting for a global regime that might generate more finance. But I would say for me, the most important sources of optimism are at national and local levels, as an alignment of constituencies are happening under the rubric of REDD, where you have heads of state making commitments to emission reductions. For example, here in Indonesia, the president has made a firm commitment to reducing emissions. We have civil society groups who want to see, for example, strengthened land tenure as part of their rights-oriented agenda, and that aligns with what's necessary for REDD. We begin to appreciate more the importance of conserving forests for other reasons, including the linkage with food security and the importance of forests in adaptation to climate change, which is only going to become more important over time. So I think for all of those reasons, there's a reason to be optimistic that these various forces in support of REDD will be able to come together and help overcome the many obstacles ahead.